until we flesh it out as a product. And part of the thing is, it isn't just doing that to flesh it out as a product. We want to be doing ad sales and additional data and work in local markets further before we blew all that out publicly. So all the underlying data is available. If Renault did something good or not so good, we could find out in any language today, and the Edelman folks can go a little bit further. And here's an example of a search. This is, as you can see, this is a 15,788 results in all blogs avec toute autorité en français, whereas in English wouldn't have been localized. So this is the example of a localized site. And then all the kind of underlying facilities. You know, one could do a search that only what did the automotive bloggers say? What did the most authoritative bloggers say? Who talked about Renault? Who also talked about GM? So that's some of those deep facilities will be all available to everybody at Edelman. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Peter.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
My name's Neville Hobson. I'm a blogger. On that slide example, you mentioned you can identify, as you can right now in Technorati,
yeah.
by language.
Uh-huh.
So you can identify a list of who blogs in France.
Yeah.
But might it be interesting, or can you identify who blogs in France?
France.
So, for example, if you get French language bloggers, you get them in Canada or any other place they happen to be.
Right.
Geography isn't typically the important thing, but you might want to know how many of these top bloggers are actually in that country.
Right.
Can you do that?
So this facility does not do that because, as you point out, we know the language.
Right.
There's some IP data that one can gather in terms of where something started, but it's very difficult to pass that stuff along. But one can filter it by what one does know, and what this product is helping Edelman do, is we do know in any given country who the most influential bloggers are. So they might look at this Renault stuff and see if this is from one of the top 20 French bloggers, that might mean something. But as you start going down the long tail, you'd have to make a decision. Did that come from Quebec or did it come from Paris?
So how do you know who the most authoritative bloggers are? What's the filter to capture that information?
So the most authoritative bloggers are by essentially inbound links or authority. So the fundamental algorithm is, for example, among UK bloggers, the most inbound links actually come to Hugh's blog over here at Gaping Void. So the authority is defined as the most inbound links. And then if you use Technorati, you can also actually zoom in on more topical authority. So for example, if Hugh writes about a souffle, he may be the most influential blogger, but he may not be the most influential food blogger. So you can go to something in Technorati called Blog Finder and then constrain a search to just food bloggers and find who the most authoritative food blogger would be. So there are a number of ways of using that. All right, thanks.
Okay. So we actually decided with Technorati to find the 100 most influential blogs by region. We worked with this algorithm as just described. We also worked as well as we could, exactly what you were just asking, to try to find the top 50 UK blogs, given the constraint that it's in English, right? So we sort of, here's a list and try and work it over. So I want to put a big star and say, this is not a quantitative sound list for the UK. It's the best we can do given what we have. Now, I also want to put a big point here. These may be the so-called top 100 by links, but in terms of prominence, A, everybody matters. B, there are different ways of measuring what is prominent, right? There are inbound links, there are a number of people who visit a given blog, so statement made. Okay, who they are, what they cover, do they cover multinationals, do they cover business, and how often do they link to each other? How often do they link to regional media or global media? Those were the questions that we sought to find answers to. So, the global 250, this is the aggregation. Perhaps it surprises you, perhaps it doesn't. The 250 most influential blogs largely are published by Americans. We don't believe this is a necessarily long-term phenomenon. It's a phenomenon of today. We think that as the blogosphere matures, that the so-called American share of voice will diminish, but you can see where the top UK blogger is, you can see where the top German blogger is, the top French blogger. And in fact, the top French and Italian bloggers also blog in English. That may tell you something.
Is that Lotte Lemire?
On y va. Okay, so here are the top 10 influential UK blogs. Again, I put this star. The data is gathered manually, not using the Technorati data exclusively. So we cannot support this quantitatively. So here's your list, and here are really the observations we have about the UK blogosphere. Most post daily, most have written about a local company, almost half have written about MNCs recently. In terms of the mix of what is covered, it's news and politics and global issues, and then third would be local issues. Note, when we get to the next countries, less about technology, which is a real difference from most markets. They cover local companies relatively infrequently. They cover MNCs more frequently than local companies. Again, you'll start to see differences among the countries that we cover. Okay, the top 10 French. You asked about Loic. Here's Loic. So you'll see some differences now. Personal journals. A lot of personal journals in France, and the second is technology. You didn't see either of those in Britain. You guys are very self-effacing and you don't use computers. No, I'm just kidding. And they talk about cooking. That's another shock, of course. So less frequency of posting. Interesting difference. Again, hardly cover local corporations. Some coverage of multinationals, but less coverage of business altogether in France than in Britain. German blogs. The number one thing they cover is tech. Number two is personal. So maybe the Germans and the Brits, something together, I don't know. They cover media. That's the third point. Didn't see that in either of the other two countries. Low interest in local corporations. This is starting to sound like a song. And weak interest in multinationals. So relatively low interest in the German blogosphere in business. Top 10 Italian blogs. Apparently this Beppe is a real character. Nearly half are personal diaries. There's something self-oriented about Italians, I guess. Who knows? But a lot of talk about politics. A lot. That's the number one thing. Much lower on tech than in France, for example. Low interest in local companies. Hardly any interest in multinationals. Note that Germany and Italy are kind of similar in this. And there's going to be more similarities that we're going to get to. Top 10 US blogs. Many of these names are, almost household with you. Engadget, Huffington Post, Daily Kos. The US are not personal bloggers. They are tech bloggers, culture bloggers, or political bloggers. Those are the top three. They do discuss local companies more than the other countries we looked at, but they're obsessed with multinationals. Now, partly because they're American and partly because they have exploding laptops. But, okay, let's look about the nuance of the differences between regions. It's really fundamental. We were talking about this morning with Sue Charman about the stages. The top 10 US bloggers link a lot to each other. The French bloggers link a lot to each other. The German and Italian bloggers tend to link to their mainstream media. Big difference among markets. Peter has a hypothesis on this about the US blogosphere, though, which is...
We saw something several months ago. We used to track who had the most inbound links, and we organized them by mainstream media through top bloggers. And you saw the top 40, of course, the BBC and the New York Times were huge, but so were the top 20 or 30 top bloggers worldwide. And then about 8 months ago, the relative number of top bloggers who had the most links started to plummet. So we started thinking, oh my God, it's over, something bad happened. What was really going on was, as the blogosphere matured from it just being a bunch of like middle-aged white guys linking to each other to suddenly